Okay, we are here on Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live on phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM or on our website www.hallmonitor.org or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight on the program, we will be joined by Vanessa Maria Graber of uh, of uh, of Philly Cam and many other organizations. And Denise Clay Murray will be here with us shortly as well. And we have Denise here. So, Denise, I'm going to bring you in right now. There you are.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Denise. Now, Denise, we have breaking news right now about the trial of Kenyatta Johnson that you've been covering. Tell us what happened.
Well, as about an hour ago, Councilman found not on charges of and bribery. Cases
So
of
it looks like we're having
from
some connectivity issues here. So we're going to bring Denise back in a second. What she was telling us is that Councilmember Johnson, this is his second trial for bribery, and he was found not guilty on both counts. So the councilman found not guilty of bribery in this trial, and this had been the second time he had been on trial for this. It was a hung jury the first time, and the government decided to try him again, and he was found not guilty. And he'll be back at City Council tomorrow. And this is on the heels of earlier today, we found out, Denise told us before the show, that a juror had been dismissed from the jury and an alternate juror had been put in that juror's place. The suspicion there was, well, it's probably going to take a while then for the deliberations. They're probably going to have to go through everything again, because it's our understanding that the alternate jurors are not in the room with the regular jurors during deliberations. So it looked like it was going to slow things down, but apparently not. And I think we have Denise again. There we go. Hi, Denise. I broke the news for you. I apologize.
Well, no, that's all right. I mean, it was about an hour or so ago when Councilman Johnson was found not guilty on all counts. He intends to be back at City Council tomorrow. He was really kind of subdued, thanking his supporters for supporting him in court, because there were a couple of times that, like particularly during closing arguments, that it got a little closer to a Phillies game than the judge liked, because some of the folks that were sitting there and watching closing arguments were either cheering the defense attorneys or making kind of comments about what the government was saying in its case. But this was a retrial. The first trial resulted in a hung jury, so they brought it. So they pretty much retried the exact same case that they tried back in the spring. But the only difference here was the result was different, and both Councilman Johnson, his wife Dawn Chavou, she's a consultant, and the former CEO of Universal Companies in South Philadelphia, Raheem Islam, and the former CFO, Shahid Dewan, were all found not guilty on bribery and honest services fraud charges.
And can you tell us a little bit about the shape of this trial compared to the previous trial?
Well, the thing is, there really wasn't all that much of a difference. The definition of insanity, they say, is to do something different, do something the exact same way and yet expect a different result. I'm pretty sure this wasn't the different result that the government was hoping for, but it was too reliant, entirely too reliant on paperwork and on the testimony of 3 people, all of whom were FBI agents. What I think a lot of people were expecting the government to do differently in this trial was to bring Ori Feibush, the developer in South Philadelphia that wanted to buy the Royal Theater, from Universal Companies and got upset when they wouldn't sell it to him. He ended up buying it anyway, and he didn't pay a whole lot, but that was kind of where the case stemmed from. And a lot of people were surprised that he wasn't put on the stand either time in this case. And I think in a lot of ways, because much of the evidence that the government put on was circumstantial and not direct. We live in a CSI culture. We live in a culture where people are looking for that, magic burst, or that magic thing that tells you poof, this person's innocent, or poof, this person's guilty. And that wasn't a part of this case. There wasn't any of that kind of evidence in this case. So because of that, that's kind of where the government fell short.
And the government in trials such as these usually has something like a 95%
Right.
conviction.
Because usually when the government investigates you in a trial and brings you to trial, they have at least 9 or 10 times the evidence they actually need to convict you. I mean, what I found most different about this trial as opposed to other trials I've covered, like former Congressman Shaka Fattah's trial or former District Attorney Seth Williams' trial, when the government came in with their evidence for those two trials, it was in boxes, it was on carts, it was like notebooks filled with stuff. And all these carts would have these huge notebooks crammed with stuff. That wasn't the case here. You saw a couple of big notebooks filled with paper, but it wasn't at the level that a lot of us who have covered federal trials are used to seeing in terms of evidence. So, like I said, much of it was circumstantial, and it's harder to prove a circumstantial case effectively. So that's where it stands, at least for this part of it. This was part of a 22 count indictment, and the trial on that, which is just Islam and Dewan, the jury is coming back for it tomorrow. I spoke to someone who's a spokesperson for the Department of Justice here in Philadelphia, and she wouldn't confirm that the trial would indeed start tomorrow, but the councilman's part of it is over, and he plans on being in city council tomorrow, and to come back to being a councilman again.
So this is Lance. I'm curious.
Hi, Lance.
Thank you very much for the update. I'm curious. What is the talk about what the judge did to the jury? So correct me if I'm wrong. In a very unusual way, the judge got notes that he didn't read out loud. He met with jurors, and he didn't tell anyone what he discussed. He met with the counsel in private in his chambers, and then he removed one juror and appointed another juror, an alternate. And within 3 hours, they came back with not guilty. Is there any discussion about what those unusual steps meant?
Well, here's the thing. That was just one of the unusual things that was going on with this jury in this particular trial. They had 5 alternates in addition to the 12 people that they impaneled to be jurors. By the time the trial ended, the juror that was put on the jury this morning was juror number 15, which means that jurors 13 and 14 were already, added to the jury because other people had been kicked off. So there was a lot that went on with this jury that, wasn't done in public. The time that the judge spent talking to the jurors shortly before the verdict came down, he brought in almost all of the jurors into his chambers with just the attorneys, the prosecution and the defense. And no one knows what was said in that room. No one knows what they were talking about, but they were at an impasse. And you could kind of tell that just from the, expressions that everyone had. And they wanted to, and I don't think that the judge wanted this particular part of the trial to come back into his courtroom, because
Looks like we lost Denise. Technical
Yeah.
difficulties.
Yeah, but Denise did answer a lot of our questions, and on what has been a very important story in Philadelphia, and now we finally have that resolution that we thought we had months ago, and then the government retried the councilman and now found not guilty. So I think that definitively puts this away now.
There's still the issue of the people that worked for Universal. I believe they pled guilty to crimes committed in the Chicago school appointments, and they have not been sentenced, and it's unclear how far or how high up the crimes go at Universal and what Universal's going to do. Universal has been forced to give back some of the schools that the school district gave them, and it's not clear whether pleading guilty is going to have any impact on the other schools and the other programs that Universal runs.
Mm-hmm. And I think we have Denise back with us here.
Well, and it's funny you bring that up, Lance. The other 20 counts that are going to be tried starting tomorrow, that's going to refer to the stuff that Universal was doing here in terms of schools. So all of that will be addressed then. The stuff in Milwaukee that has already been addressed. They've already pled guilty to that, which means no matter what happens tomorrow or what happens with that part of the trial, Islam and Dewan are probably going to be doing some jail time based on what happened there.
I got my cities wrong. Milwaukee, not Chicago.
Well, that's okay.
It doesn't seem like it has had much of an impact on Universal, the fact that their chief operating officer has pled guilty to bribery in Milwaukee.
Well, here's the thing. Universal is about to lose 2 of its schools. It has ended its agreement with Bluford to be a charter management and 1 other school. And those agreements end on July 31st. I think that in the end, no matter what happens in terms of the convictions for this trial, or no matter, in terms of the trial itself, I think that the school district of Philadelphia is going to be looking long and hard at its relationship with Universal, because it kind of has to. When the former CEO and the former CFO of a school management company end up in federal court, that's going to make people ask questions. So I get the feeling that their relationship with the school district of Philadelphia is going to be reevaluated, in relation to this. It can't help but be.
All right. Well, Denise, thank you so much for covering that. And I know you're going to have more in the Philadelphia Sunday Sun about that this weekend.
Yes, and a lot of people have been following my Twitter feed because I've been covering the trial in real time. So if you don't want to wait for my story to come out in the Sun, you can just check out my Twitter feed and get as much detail as I was able to get from that.
Okay. Well, make sure you do that.
And if any of the jurors decide to talk, please let us know.
Yes.
I will do that. I will do that.
The judge, did the judge order them not to discuss the removal?
Well, here's the thing. This jury is about to listen to the other 22 counts. That's why it was so important to the government that this part of the trial get done right away. Because these other 20 counts, the same jury has to hear. The reason why that case didn't move forward when the retrial happened back in the spring was because the original plan was to have the jury hear both trials. And when the first trial ended in a mistrial, they said, well, instead of having you hear both trials, we're just going to get a completely new jury.
I see.
Okay. Well, Denise, thank you for that. And so now what we'll do is bring in our guest, Vanessa Maria Graber of Free Press.
Hey,
Good evening, Vanessa. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. Thank you for having me here.
Always great to have you with us. And we have a lot to talk about tonight. In addition to the breaking news that Denise just gave us, we have an election coming up next week. And we always talk about, I feel like every election we always say, well, this is the most important election of our lifetime. But honestly, they all kind of feel that way now, particularly with what's going on nationally and locally. So what I'd like to start off with, we have two very important elections here, the gubernatorial election and the Senate election here in Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro versus Doug Mastriano for governor, and John Fetterman versus Mehmet Oz for Senate. We're looking at, I think, in a strange way, two very different races. And there are a lot of reasons for that we'll get into. But the first thing I'd like to talk about, when we look at the Shapiro and the Fetterman campaigns, have they done enough to reach out to marginalized communities in Philadelphia, or are they taking the Philadelphia vote for granted?
That's a really good question. I mean, I have done a lot of canvassing and voter outreach through a group called Philly Boricuas. As a volunteer, we're independent. We do this with our own money. And a lot of the time, we would go to parks in North Philly, like Hunting Park, Juniata Park, North Square, Fair Hill Square. Also join in like health fairs and other community events. We set up in front of grocery stores and post offices. So we wound up talking to a lot of people, and most people that we talked to would say that they didn't really get any outreach. No politicians are coming in there. There's no events that they're aware of in their community. And at least when it comes to their social media feed, they're not seeing a lot of content there. And so I think it depends on who you ask, right? There's various marginalized communities in Philadelphia. My work is primarily in North Philadelphia with Puerto Rican population, where by and large, even with people who are Democratic, they support Democrats, they feel as though there hasn't been any outreach to them. There hasn't been specific rhetoric that is talking about their concerns about crime and inflation and the opioid crisis and the rising costs of housing and the displacement that people are facing. Those are local issues, but obviously we're facing that as a nation all across the country in many different cities. So even though people have localized concerns, people like John Fetterman, Mehmet Oz, Josh Shapiro, and Doug Mastriano really should be speaking to voters in different cities across Pennsylvania to those specific issues. Philadelphia is the poorest, largest city in the country. So poverty is a really big issue, and especially it's been exacerbated with inflation. People want to know what's going to happen. Are prices going to continue to rise? What can be done at the local level? I don't think people are seeing a connection between these policy proposals and how it's going to affect them directly. And so when it comes to direct outreach to these populations, they're not seeing it according to them. And when it comes to the rhetoric that they're, posting in a lot of their campaign messaging, it's very vague, right? And a lot of the ads that we're seeing, by and large, are attack ads. They're attacking the other candidate, but they're not really promoting specific policy proposals that people from those communities can look at and say, oh, this is how that's going to change in my community. So I do think that they are making a lot of assumptions about the power of straight ticket Democratic voters, at least on the Democratic side. And with Republicans, I think they're focusing on their current strongholds, like the Northeast, neighborhoods like Port Richmond and Pensport and South Philly. And they're not really bothering with a lot of those other neighborhoods where, it's mostly people of color. because that's not really who their base is.
Denise, you've been critical of the Fetterman campaign in particular for not doing enough here in Philadelphia. Do you? Oh, it looks like we lost Denise, so we'll come back to her in a second. But Denise has been critical of the Fetterman campaign for not doing much in Philadelphia, and I think that is true. I don't think that there's any other way to explain that. Oh, we have Denise back. Here she is. Hi, Denise. I was just saying, you've been critical of the Fetterman campaign for not spending a lot of time in Philadelphia. How do you think that has impacted his candidacy here?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. Some people, it hasn't impacted it at all because they're under the impression that, you have to vote pragmatically. And that's correct to an extent because, let's face it, you have two parties that, because we're not, Europe or any other, society where we have more than two parties, we have two parties. One wants to basically tear the entire government down and burn its pieces in a trash dump. The other one does not. And, folks think that because they're part of the party that does not want to burn down the government, that you should vote for them. But the thing is, you have to ask people for their vote. And when you can't make the time to sit down and talk to them, unless it's just the people that are friendly toward you, and that's fine, you can do that. But I think that what this election is going to show is whether or not you can win elected office as a Democrat without doing any kind of true active outreach in the Black community. And if Fetterman manages to get elected to the Senate without doing any active outreach to the Black community in Philadelphia, other candidates are going to get the idea that they can do it too. And that means that one of the Democratic Party's most reliable voting blocks is going to get told to kick rocks. And it's going to be interesting to see how Black people react to that.
Right. Again, the feeling that the Black community and other constituencies typical of the Democratic Party have been taken advantage of and have been taken for granted. Lance, do you feel that last week's debate will hinder Fetterman's campaign in these last couple of weeks? Well, this last week we have here.
I'm sure that it will. I don't think there's anybody who watched it who wasn't somewhat horrified by how difficult it was for him. And I think that's our first impression. When we start thinking about it, many of us give him credit for standing up when he knew full well that it wasn't going to look good, and standing up and saying, here I am, I've had a stroke, I can function, I may not be the best debater, I may not be the person who speaks the clearest, but I am here, I have positions, and my positions are closer to what the people want than what Dr. Oz's are. Focusing back on what our guest and Denise are talking about, there is some section of us, I think, who can hold ourselves accountable. We don't ask the questions, and part of that's us being in the media, and I'm hoping that Hall Monitor will solve that for the mayor's race, where we will make more of an attempt to go out into communities, to the RCOs, registered community organizations, to civic groups, and say, what questions would you like to ask the candidates? And then be the conduit to make sure those candidates hear those questions. Unfortunately, the mainstream media, with all the layoffs and all the difficulties and getting rid of all the seasoned reporters, it gets reported as if it's only about who's going to win, and the actual issues play a tertiary role at best. So we don't have we don't have reporters going into communities and saying, what are your issues? And then bringing those questions back to elected reporters. And we have communities that are so troubled and in such desperate situations that they're not organizing themselves to knock on the doors of the candidates' offices and say, where do you stand on this issue? And part of that is watching Trump run a campaign that completely took advantage of his constituents. Trump lied about almost everything that he was offering. Better health care didn't happen. stop the jobs from moving to Mexico, didn't happen. A better tax structure didn't happen. Tax breaks that were going to create jobs didn't happen. So while it's true that there may be candidates who are willing to take the African American or Latino or gay vote for granted, we have to recognize that this is because Trump was so successful at not just taking his constituents for granted, but outright lying to them and still getting them to vote for him. I'm hoping going forward that we're going to learn, we in the media and we as civic associations are going to learn that if we don't ask the questions are not going to get asked.
Well, and that's absolutely right. And I think this goes back to also points Vanessa and Denise are making. In any of these commercials, have you seen a policy proposal? I haven't. And even, and this is one of the issues that I've had for a while about the way debates are structured. You don't get a chance to really answer a question. There's never been a debate that I can remember where, if you're talking about Social Security, somebody says, okay, I have this chart that's going to show you what I'm talking about. You know, we don't see things like that. And I was looking through candidate websites. I have been since the beginning, and you don't see things like that anymore. There are very, very pithy kind of, we're going to do this kind of answers, but there are no details, which I guess is by design. So this Senate race is very, very close, and it was getting closer even before that to debate. What do we attribute that to? Why is this such a close election when it looks like the candidates are very different? Vanessa, let me go to you first on that. I think you're muted there.
The seat was originally held by a Republican, Pat Toomey. So, you know, I think there's a desire on the part of Republicans to see another Republican get elected to that seat, especially in light of the, 50-50 Senate split right now, which makes it very difficult to pass legislation. Ultimately, there's 9 key races across the country that are really going to determine the makeup of the Senate that are highly contested. I also think that they're 2 very unlikely candidates. We have Dr. Oz, who doesn't really live in Pennsylvania, most people say, is a TV star, is, a doctor. He's not a lifelong politician. And then you have John Fetterman, who does have experience, but, he's kind of an outsider in the Democratic Party. He leans a lot further left than most Democrats, like Josh Shapiro, who's definitely more on the moderate side. He's kind of weird looking, 6'8". He's kind of intimidating looking. So you put them together, 2 very unlikely candidates. They both have very different campaigns. It's very polarizing. And at least with a lot of the messaging out there, it is hard for voters who are not Democratic or Republican. I'm talking about swing voters or independents to decide who they want to go with, right? I think that people are also being bombarded with an immense amount of advertisements. I mean, you've surely seen the billboards along the bridges and along Interstate 95 that are very jarring. I think I heard that this was the most money ever spent on a Senate campaign. So it's record breaking. Again, that's a result of super PACs and the Citizens United ruling. And a lot of that money, again, is being spent on advertisements. And we're seeing a lot of ads on YouTube. I know I've seen them, and on social media. So it's hard for voters to decide. And again, I'm talking about the people who aren't straight Democrats or Republicans who are used to always voting for their party, but that group of people that either is independent or really doesn't like either party. I think it's hard for them to decide who to go with because they are just at extremes in a lot of ways.
And conversely, and Denise, let me ask you about this. We have a gubernatorial race that is kind of the opposite. Josh Shapiro is the Democratic nominee, had no challenge in the Democratic primary, was the candidate from the very beginning, versus Doug Mastriano. And this, based on the polls, and we'll talk a little bit about polls a little later, whether or not they're trustworthy or not. I lean more towards not necessarily, although in this case, it probably is more accurate than not. Josh Shapiro has at least a 10-point lead over Doug Mastriano. So we have the Senate race where it's very close and this gubernatorial race where it's not close at all. How are you looking in that gubernatorial race, Denise? And I think you're muted there.
Okay, let me unmute. Okay, first of all, I'm still trying to figure out how Josh Shapiro ended up the only Democratic candidate, because that's not how this should go. I mean, the Republicans, despite the fact that they chose Doug Mastriano, they had choices. They had a lot of choices. And he's who they decided on, although I'm still trying to figure out why they did that, because if you would have looked at his record in the state assembly, he's the last guy you would pick, because Pennsylvania is a lot more moderate in terms of its right wing than people want to admit. And, you know, you look at, and part of the reason why we've had like Republican governors that have successfully, you know, gone into the governor's mansion in Harrisburg is because they don't scare people to the level that Doug Mastriano does in a lot of ways. And that's probably one of the reasons why the polls say that Josh Shapiro is 10 points up. But I've lived in Western Pennsylvania, and let's just be honest, I've lived in Klan country in Pennsylvania. I don't think it's actually going to be that close when the vote is taken. Shapiro will probably win against Mastriano because the Republican Party nationally and even locally isn't putting a lot of money into this race. Mastriano wasn't who they wanted, and they're not really financing him. But that said, there is a segment of Pennsylvania that he speaks to, and that segment was part of the group of people that he put on buses and took to the rally in Washington on January 6, 2021. So you can't count that out. You can't count that segment of the population out. And there is more of that in Pennsylvania than people want to admit. So while Shapiro will probably win, it will probably not be by 10 points, because sometimes we don't count everybody accurately. And sometimes people just lie to you when you ask them poll questions because they don't want to, you know, they don't want to be seen as racist or a bad person or something. And yet they'll go into a voting booth and they'll vote for Doug Mastriano. So while it is 10 points in the polls, I don't think it's going to be that high on election night.
And you had mentioned different segments, different parts of the state. Lance, you had been taking a look at some things going on in places like Bucks County with some congressional races and some state house races. What have you found?
I think the most interesting race that's not being covered is the congressional race in Bucks County. The incumbent is Brian Fitzpatrick, who for the first time since he's been running did not get the Philadelphia Inquirer's endorsement. And he's running against Ashley Ahaz, who's a graduate of West Point, has been a leader in the service. She's a fighter pilot. She's led battalions in Afghanistan and in other parts of the Mideast. So it's a race where it's a district where Trump lost, Biden won, and Biden won 51% and Trump got 47%. There was actually close to a 35,000 vote difference. But yet Fitzpatrick has won as a Republican almost every time. Fitzpatrick refused to vote for the January 6th committee to investigate the insurgency. He refused to hold Trump accountable for the lies about the election. When the Supreme Court handed down the overturning of Roe v. Wade, Fitzpatrick didn't condemn it, and he still won't condemn it. It's almost impossible to figure out what his position on abortion is. Fitzpatrick holds himself out as a person in the middle, but he has really been the excuse for for Trump, and he has excused Trump at every turn. And now, so here we have a district that voted against Trump, that has voted continually for Democrats, with the exception of Brian Fitzpatrick, who up until this time has always had labor union support and always had the endorsements of the newspapers. I think that becomes a really interesting race going forward for what will happen in the presidential election in 2024. Will the people in Bucks County hold Fitzpatrick accountable for Fitzpatrick excusing and creating apologies and making believe that Trump is normal? Will the people of Bucks County be willing to say, we don't want a candidate who's clearly going to say where they stand on abortion? The one thing that I think might make the difference for Fitzpatrick is how much money he's raised from corporate America. He has raised over $4 million. Ms. Ezaz has raised less than $1 million. The financial community has come to try and save Congressman Fitzpatrick. They're his largest single funders, and that may be enough for the difference. But I think it's a race that people should be aware of. I think it's a race people should look at, and I think it's a way of telling where we are as a people. And I think that's critically important for us to be honest with ourselves. If we don't turn out to vote, if those of us who are in the communities don't organize ourselves and organize our communities to make demands that elected officials answer questions, if we're foolish enough to fall for the snake oil promises, for the empty words, for the slick advertisements, then we get what we deserve. I don't think we can look at an election and make believe that somebody other than us is voting. We're the ones who are voting or not voting. We're the ones who are deciding who we're voting for. And we're deciding that, unfortunately, all too often in the same way we decide which floor cleaner we're going to buy or which snack food we're going to buy. But that really is on us. We can't blame the candidates who, whether it's their egos or it's their belief in themselves or there's some pathology there, they want to win. And they're going to look at the last election and they're going to see who won and why they won, and they're going to adopt that practice. So if Trump can win by making empty promises and abusing his own constituents, why shouldn't Dr. Oz try the same thing? Why shouldn't he sell pills that don't work, claim that they're miracle medicines that nobody else thinks work? Dr. Oz has a dual citizenship. He's not even an American. He has this dual citizenship in Turkey, and that's not discussed. But if we don't care enough as voters and we vote for him anyway, then why should the next candidate care about those issues either?
Yep. And one of the things that you have to look at is, like Lance said, could this race in a Collier County of Philadelphia be a harbinger of what's going to happen, not just statewide, but nationally? There's a lot on the line here and a lot of questions that still haven't been answered about the fallout from the Trump presidency and this Trumpism that still exists. One of the things that has concerned me is the actual act of polling and whether or not polls are accurate and how they influence people's decisions on if they're going to vote, how they're going to vote. And anecdotally, what I've been hearing is young people have been disproportionately excluded from these polls. And I look for some hard evidence of that. So the last couple of days, I've been going through polls where national polls, not just Pennsylvania, so Senate and gubernatorial polls from across the country. And some of the polls don't give you a lot of demographic information, but some do a very good job of it. And what I found is that young people are polled. And when I say young people, let's just say, I think like 18 to 45 would be that age group that I'm talking about. They are polled less than people from 45 and above. And I wanted to find a little bit more hard evidence about what that really means. And I found one poll. This was a poll in Wisconsin that was polling the Senate race, Ron Johnson versus Mandela Barnes. And I found this piece of information I found was fascinating. Not only did the poll have a margin of error, which was about 3 or 4%, which is standard, that's normal. It had margins of error built into the poll for each demographic. for each age range. And the margin of error for voters under, or potential voters under 35 was 9% in this poll. 9%. It's the only time I've ever really seen that. And it was fascinating to me. So Vanessa, let me come to you on this. Do you feel that these polls are something in which we can take stock, or should we be very, very incredulous about these polls?
Well, again, this is speculation without actually evaluating data, but I'm an adjunct professor at Stockton University and I teach principles of journalism. I ask my students all the time about the news. I ask them about elections. When I asked them if they were registered to vote, most of them said that they were not and they hadn't voted. So, there's some anecdotal evidence I know. One of the things, having been a pollster, I used to do the Carolina poll, is you call landlines. Most of the numbers they give you are landlines. We know a lot of younger people don't have landlines anymore. If they do have cell phone numbers, how many times do you answer a phone number that you don't know? By and large, younger people are not answering the phone, right? Like they don't like to talk on the phone as much. They much rather engage on social media or through text message or messaging apps like WhatsApp and Telegram. And those aren't the ways that we're reaching people. The same can be said about Latinos and other immigrant groups, right? They're not being met where they're at. And so a part of the work that we do at Free Press is encouraging journalists and other media outlets who want to do engagement work is to change platforms. If you're not able to reach people at community events, then go to where they're at. Or if you're not able to reach them on a Facebook page, change to a platform where that community is. The same can be true for polling, right? If we're not polling people on the platforms that they frequently utilize, or in the communication forum that they're most comfortable with, we're not going to capture those people. If we're not actually at a place with a clipboard asking questions with survey, like we used to do back in the day, a lot of surveys and stuff we used to do like in person, just like that at the mall. We're not doing that anymore. So I think that accounts for a big reason why we're not reaching those folks. But at the same time, a lot of younger people are, like I said, they're not registered to vote. They're not voting. They're voting in less numbers. So I think maybe they're not focusing their attention on those groups because maybe they don't think it's worth talking to them if they're not knowledgeable. Having been a pollster and called people who don't know anything about the questions you're asking, it doesn't really make for a good survey result. And sometimes we have to throw those surveys away. Just because, if a person's like, I don't know what you're talking about, I never heard about that, or I don't have an opinion on that. There's also just a lot of apathy, right? People say things like, I'm not political. I don't watch the news. It's a challenge even in my class, right? To get my students to follow the news and follow the elections and be able to formulate an opinion on it. So I think when it comes to polling, it can be useful when you're thinking about people who traditionally vote, right? I think there's a lot of accuracy in that, and people who are likely to participate in a poll. But does it represent the diversity of the population at large, including younger people? I don't think so. And I think we need different forms of survey tools in order to get a more accurate picture.
And if that's true, and I believe you're definitely on the mark there, that would give a little more hope to Democratic candidates, because younger people do tend to skew a little more Democratic. But again, who knows? We really don't know the outcome of an election until it's over. So bringing it a little more local here, we have Senate candidate, gubernatorial candidate, we have congressional candidates, we have half the Pennsylvania State Senate and half the State House. But in this election, we're also going to see 4 special elections here in Philadelphia for city council. So Denise, what do you think about having these special elections on election day, this important midterm election? And there was also a little bit of controversy about the scheduling of these elections. What has been your take on what this will look like?
Honestly, I think if this had been planned out a little better, this could be a means of getting more people to the polls because they have something that is directly connected to them that they can vote for. But this wasn't planned all that well. And the main reason it wasn't planned all that well was because of when people decided to drop out for and run for mayor, because the Philadelphia City Charter demands that if you're going to run for a political office and you're already in a city job or in a city politician role, you have to resign from that role. And because of how close a lot of the people who did resign did this, it kind of made people scramble in terms of getting a special election together. In fact, initially, Darrell Clark was only going to have a special election for the 2 district council seats and not the at-large seats. And then something happened in city council that made him realize that, okay, I'm going to need people to vote on different things, and we're not going to have enough of a majority to be veto proof if I don't have a special election for all the seats that are open, not just the 2 that are district council seats. And like I said, there was a lot of ways that this could have been done better that would have made this something that, people were like, oh, good, I'm going to go and vote and it's going to increase turnout. But the way it is now, if you have a mail-in ballot that you were planning on using, you may have gotten it too late for you to be able to physically mail it. You may have to walk it into the commissioner's office or something, so that way you make sure it's counted.
Okay, and Lance, let me come to you with, and really anybody who wants to jump in on this one. What are we looking at, and how do we determine and gauge turnout in low-income areas, the areas that probably should have the most at stake in this election will probably have the lowest turnout? Why do we see this, and what are some of the things we can do about it?
I think Denise has been doing the best job of keeping track of where the poverty is, in which wards, and what the voter turnout is in which wards. So I'm going to defer to her, and then I'll wait and see if there's time for me to chip in.
Okay. Well, I think that, and that's exactly how we have to look at it. We have to look at the wards where there is the most poverty and see what turnout is in those wards. And then we have to make a plan to engage people, to let them know that, sure, the system has really screwed you over. We can't deny that. But if you want it to stop screwing you over, you have to participate. Because what I've learned over the years of covering politics is that if a politician believes that he or she can ignore you and ignore your issues and not have to work on them, that's what they're going to do. And unfortunately, people don't go into these neighborhoods and actively talk to these folks and let them know that your votes count too. And, sometimes even the people who represent them don't go in there and tell them that their votes count too. So we have to figure out a way to better engage people who are a little harder to engage because there are other pressing needs that they have to meet that just might be a little more important to them than going to the polls. Stuff like, having enough food on the table, a roof over your head, making sure your kid can go to school without getting shot on the way. We have to address those issues if we want this particular population to be engaged enough to want to come out and vote.
Vanessa, what do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot of issues. As I said, when we did voter outreach in those different neighborhoods in North Philadelphia, there was a lot of voter apathy. People that just felt like their vote didn't count, their voices weren't being heard. They said both political parties are the same. They didn't really see a tangible difference in their day-to-day life by going out to vote. And so I've said this before, voters need to see progress. They need to see that policies that they passed in during their term actually resulted in some positive change. They need to hear specific policy proposals in order to feel motivated. But there's other factors that are much more simple than that don't have to do with party politics. And what we found is a lot of difficulty in understanding how to get to their polling place, because a lot of the polling place had changed. If you look on the websites, they're not very accessible on mobile phones, which is how most people were accessing polling and voter information. Like, for example, one of the spreadsheets, that had all the polling, just like people couldn't read that on their phones. There's a lot of people, especially older people, they had old glasses, they couldn't see, so they would bring us websites and things on their phone and ask us to read it for them. People had difficulty filling out the applications for mail-in ballots. They needed assistance with that. And so we're just not seeing a lot of support for people that do want to vote and who have consistently voted, and for making things more accessible, putting things in different languages like Spanish, for example. They still haven't done a great job with putting out voter materials in the languages that people speak. They're not utilizing text message as much as they could in order to provide people information. Tons of people told us, like, can you text that to me? Because we would explain how to do it. And they're like, text it to me so I can remember it and I could see it. And so, there's a lot of interest. There's people that vote, but there's some accessibility issues. Transportation, childcare were also barriers for people to get to their polling places. A lot of people didn't know about early voting or what their rights were when it comes to early voting. And so there's just a lot of education that needs to be done, the civic information that people need in order to fully participate. And I just want to read some information. This is from a story where I was interviewed in the Philadelphia Citizen about the work that we did in Hunting Park. And it was like so disappointing because it said that out of the city's 66 wards, the 7th ward, which is part of Hunting Park, was one of 4 to fall below 50%. So only 6,700 people cast ballots in Ward 7, which was a decrease of more than 1,000 votes from 2016. So that's after we did all of this outreach. We spent every weekend for months in those neighborhoods, only to find out that 1,000 people less voted that year. And I don't even remember saying this quote, but I am going to read it because it does make sense, is that you can't go up to people who are barely surviving, barely living, and want them to participate in voting for the community. And I think that that's real when people's basic needs are not being met. They're struggling, they're dealing with anxiety and mental health issues. Voting then becomes a really low priority unless you make it really enticing and irresistible and very accessible to them.
Okay.
I'd like to follow up with that on a point. All too often, quote unquote, liberals attack the Democratic Party machine, the ward leaders, the committee members. And once that structure falls apart, it's exactly what we're talking about. There's nobody left to get the information down block by block by block. And while progressives often talk about organizations being important, they also attack the one organization in the city that really could get the voter turnout to be much higher. And I think I put part of the blame on the editorial board of the Inquirer that seems to think there's something wrong with a Democratic Party machine or any organizational, quote unquote, machine that's organized, that has committee people, that works on a block by block level, that gets people to turn out the vote. If I could do it differently, I would say we ought to make these people heroes who volunteer their time, who register people to vote, who go door to door and tell people where the polling place is, who organize the car rides to the polling place, who get the absentee ballots filled out and help people vote. Instead of doing what we currently do, and we're going to have, at least in the mayor's race, we're going to have one candidate who's going to say she ran against the machine. She thinks the Democratic Party machine that does all this work is the problem. And what that means, of course, is only upper middle class people vote. And it's not a surprise to me. The Inquirer recently came out and said they don't want people to vote for charter changes. They don't think that's necessary. They don't want people to vote for row offices, sheriff, and other offices. They don't think that's necessary. So we see this wave of quote unquote liberals or progressives being against democratic institutions and trying to supplant quote unquote experts for democracy. And that becomes part of the problem. And layered on top of that is how much money it costs to run for office. Where does the money come from? Rarely do poor people kick in and support candidates because they don't have enough to give. So it's the multimillionaires through all of these underhanded ways that fund these campaigns. Dr. Oz is attempting to buy the Senate seat. He's spending more than $25 million of his family's wealth, because he married into one of the wealthiest families in Pennsylvania. He's spending $25 million to try and buy the votes and buy the seat. And until we put an end to that, until we appreciate community groups, the RCOs, the neighborhood groups, the civic groups, the groups like Vanessa's talking about that go out and register people and help them get the vote out, then it's going to be almost impossible to convince candidates to talk about issues that will give people a reason to vote for them.
Okay, and speaking of charter changes, there are two on the ballot in addition to the candidates we'll be voting for in this election. The first one, should the Philadelphia Home Rule Charter be amended to create the Department of Aviation to transfer certain functions related to the operation of city airports from the other city agencies to the Department of Aviation? My understanding of this bill, and I covered this when it came up, is that the airport feels like if all this was under one roof in a Department of Aviation, when we talk about what the airport does and all the other ancillary things that come into it, it would streamline and make it more effective for them to get what they need and make it work a little better. So that's why that is on the ballot. And then the second one, should the Philadelphia Home Rule Charter be amended to provide a preference in civil service examinations for qualified graduates of career technical education programs of the School District of Philadelphia? This bill is very interesting, and it has kind of had a fraught path. Right now, veterans and the children of slain police officers and firefighters receive a 10-point preference on the civil service exam, meaning that they get 10 points going into it and add it to their score. This would also allow career and technical education graduates to get a 5-point civil service bonus on the civil service exam, and it would be available to them for 36 months after graduation, if they have graduated from a CTE program in Philadelphia. So this was, I think, probably the first bill that Councilmember Catherine Gilmore Richardson put on the ballot or introduced to City Council, and veterans groups were against it, and it's taken almost 3 years now for it to get to this point. So it will be on the ballot in this election. Those two questions are yes or no questions. Please make sure you do that, because sometimes it's easy to forget about it. I'd like to thank our guest, Vanessa Maria Graber, for being with us. I'd also like to thank our own Lance Haver and Denise Clay Murray for always being here. And we will see you next week on Hall Monitor.
And make sure you vote. Make sure you vote so we can discuss what you did Wednesday. Come back and watch us. Channel 66, Comcast 29, Fios. Watch us so you can hear reports that you're not going to see anyplace else.
That's right.